Here on The Colour of Country Life, we're joined by the CEO of the Australian Banking Association, Anna Bligh. Thanks for calling in, Anna.
Pleasure.
We have this commentary that's come out of Federal Parliament yesterday from Michael McCormack having a dig at banking executives over regional bank closures. I'll just play a little bit of that for you from yesterday.
The chief executive officers, very well paid, I might add, of our major banks, getting all woke and wanting to work on Australia Day, and yet not wanting to have branches in regional communities where there are high Indigenous proportions of the populations.
Would you accept that sort of criticism of the bank CEOs and just what's happening in regional Australia with bank closures?
I think Michael McCormack's making political points, seeking political mileage as you'd expect in the Parliament. On the issue of branches and accessibility to banking services, this is a really important issue for all Australians because what we're seeing is the largest ever transformation in how customers are seeking to do their banking, and it's accelerating at an unprecedented pace ever in the history of the country. And how banks manage that transformation with their customers is really going to matter to everybody, regardless of where you live. And of course, there are particular issues in regional and rural Australia, and there'll be particular issues for some Aboriginal people. But getting this right is very important. So what's actually happening out there? In their tens of thousands, customers are moving their banking online and into the digital world. And what banks are doing is making sure that they can still operate their businesses, make sure their customers get services. And when they do close a branch, because people in the local area have really stopped using it almost entirely, what they do is pay Australia Post to keep those services in town. So I do accept that sometimes it's a very hard thing for people to see something close in their local town, and people, for all kinds of very good reasons, can feel quite sad about that or angry. But the reality is that customers are moving the way they bank at an unprecedented pace, and banks are doing their best to keep up with that.
Now, there was a regional banking task force by the former coalition government that made recommendations, one of which was that there would be impact assessments required from the middle of this year before banks considered closing branches. Is that something that you understand your members are looking to implement from the middle of June?
Yes, to the Regional Banking Task Force, again, set up by the government that Michael McCormack was part of, in fact, a very senior member of. That process went through. There was 400 public submissions. There was a great deal of work. There were inquiries held in 2 regional centres, and lots of people got to have their say. And there were a number of recommendations. Banks have accepted all of them. We did say we'd have that protocol in place by the middle of the year. We're having a look at it. If we can fast track it a bit, we will, but it does require some consultation with regulators and consumer organisations. We want to get it right as well.
And I noticed then one of your fellow Queenslanders, Gerard Rennick, an LNP senator, not long after that task force concluded and now they're in opposition, moved for a new Senate inquiry into regional bank closures. The committee wrote to the major banks saying, please stop closing branches while the inquiry's underway. The Commonwealth said they'll agree with that. They'll put a moratorium on further closures, but some other banks saying they're not going to impose that moratorium.
Well, every bank is different. They might look a lot alike from the outside, but they've all got their own commercial realities and they have their own different circumstances in relation to where their branches are. Of course, there are a number of banks in Australia that have never had a branch and never will, and there's a lot of competition out there around getting the best and safest services in the online area. So banks, they need to be competitive. We want them to be competitive. They need to be putting money and big money into the online environment so that every customer that's moving into that area can be safe and protected from scammers and hackers. And they need to make sure that they can still provide services through Australia Post and through their call centres. One of the things, interestingly, that we saw in COVID, many customers who were unable to go and visit their branch because they were in lockdown, started to use the call centres of their banks to do basic banking services. And that increase in phone banking has stayed post-COVID, and banks are putting more people into those services so that customers who want to do things on the phone, instead of going to their branch, can do so. So I don't think it's a surprise that some banks are putting a moratorium on and some banks aren't. They're very different big commercial organisations, and they'll make decisions in the interests of getting the best services to their customers depending on the shape of their branch footprint.
Now, we spoke with one Commonwealth Bank customer who's a 90-year-old, and when they've imposed a moratorium, she says nonetheless she'll look to shift her banking anyway if they're only willing to give a 12-month moratorium commitment, because she's got a term deposit that goes for longer than 12 months. I know there are a diminishing number of customers, the nonagenarians and the octogenarians, but is there a risk for banks that they might see them shift their banking to, say, a credit union or something like that?
Well, I think the banking environment is very competitive. And I would say to customers, if there are services you want that your bank is not offering, there are other banks out there. Australia Post, for example, provides banking services for 82 financial institutions in Australia. So there's a lot of choice at the post office, from the smallest credit unions in the country to the largest banks. If somebody feels that they can get a better deal somewhere else, that's how the system gets better. And I'm not sure that the credit union that your caller talked about is going to have a branch in a place where a bank doesn't. But if they do, well, that's how the world works. If she's a customer and she's voting with her feet.
Yep, that's certainly, they're entitled to do that. I know some listeners will be yelling at the radio at the moment asking about the multi-billion-dollar profits, say, that Commonwealth Bank put out this week, and yet they're closing in regional areas. What is the bank position on that? They make big profits, but yet they do close regional branches. It's purely a commercial decision?
It's absolutely a commercial decision, but it's also about ensuring that they are putting their resources where most of their customers are. So they're putting their operational money into improving the safety of their online environment, their apps, their call centres, because that's where customers are banking. And I know that there are some customers who are not there, and that's why they're also putting money into Australia Post. They have very substantial contracts with Australia Post to conduct banking services. I don't think there's a town in Australia that ever had a branch that doesn't have a post office. And what that does, post office has 3,500 locations across Australia, and that effectively extends the branch network. So we still have a very big branch network across Australia. It's not about to disappear, but it is going to change. And as customers stop using branches, it makes sense for any business, if they saw the kind of I think the last figure I saw was, on average across the last 5 years, branch traffic, people walking into branches and doing their transactions, has fallen by 68%. There aren't many businesses out there who would still be keeping their business open if their customers had moved online and stopped coming into the shop front. Just on the issue of profits, I think it is important to remember the role that banks play in our economy. Firstly, very strong, stable banks have helped Australia get through some of the biggest external shocks, whether it's the GFC or COVID. Having those big buffers and those profits has helped them help their customers and keep the economy running and stay stable. Banks were never had to be bailed out in this country by taxpayers, as they did in the UK and many other places. Secondly, those profits don't go, to some fat cat somewhere. Those profits go back into the Australian economy. More than 80% of the profits from CommBank yesterday will be going into their shareholders, and those shareholders overwhelmingly are either individual Australians who own shares in the Commonwealth Bank. Many of them are self-funded retirees, and they've had a pretty lean decade with low interest rates. So those self-funded retirees, I think, will be very happy to see those numbers going into their retirement savings. But for every other Australian who has a job, their superannuation funds invest in Australian banks, and those profits will be going into the superannuation funds of every Australian. So we shouldn't wish them away too quickly.
And Adam Bligh, just before you go, back to you mentioned Australia Post a number of times. Our 90-year-old wasn't excited about the idea of doing her confidential banking at a post branch. We will ask Australia Post about this, but is there a case for maybe a restructure of exactly the facilities of Australia Post so some more confidential banking can occur at what is otherwise a pretty secure sort of parcel handover counter?
I think that's a really good question. And as you said earlier on, there is yet another review of this, but hopefully maybe this review gives us a chance to think more creatively or gives Australia Post an opportunity with banks who contract them a chance to think a little bit more creatively about some of the issues about, such as privacy. I can appreciate, all of us want our financial dealings to be, kept as confidential as they can. And that's certainly something that I think could be thought about in the review.
Anna Bligh is the CEO of the Australian Banking Association. You've been generous with your time. Thanks so much for going through the detail for us today here on Flow.
Pleasure. Thank you.